Hello and welcome to another tutorial video. As you can see, we're going to be discussing the filter function in Excel here, so it's a bit of a change of pace. So Microsoft has added dozens of new features, formulas, and functions to Excel over the past few years. We previously covered XLOOKUP, so you can take a look at that lesson in this channel if you want. This time around, I want to discuss filter, which is probably one of the top 5 most useful functions added to Excel over this time frame. It's obviously useful for analyzing data, but what a lot of people don't realize is that it can be very useful for financial models as well, especially when you are doing some asset level modeling. So when you're looking at private equity portfolio companies or individual properties in real estate or something like that. The way I think about it is that functions like XLOOKUP, index match, and indirect are sort of like Spider-Man. They're very good at jumping around and finding individual results in ranges of cells. But filter is sort of like when Spider-Man enters the multiverse, and now you have multiple Spider-Mans going all over and retrieving multiple values or multiple records for you in the data. So let's start with the filter basics. You enter the function and then you specify an array, so a range of cells in most cases, and then you specify inclusion criteria, and then you say what you want it to do if there is nothing matching your inclusion criteria. With this, one important note is that this inclusion criteria, if you're entering a range here, it needs to match the range of cells that you're entering in the beginning. So if your range here has 5 rows in it, then any type of criteria that you're entering that needs to match up also has to have 5 rows in it. So let's take a look at a simple example here. And let's say that we want to look at a range of customer orders and we want to retrieve the orders that are worth more than $1,000. So I'm going to pull up this data in the Excel file. This is customer order data, and here is everything spelled out. I can go over here, and in this area, I've created this alternate section that will have filter data. So I'll enter filter, and then we'll go over here, and let's select this whole area going from B6 through J104. And then for the next part, we need to enter the include or inclusion criteria. With this, we need to have a match. So our area here starts in row 6 and then goes down to row 104, and we want the inclusion criteria to do the same thing so that this works properly. So I'll enter this whole range, and then I'll say greater than 1,000 because these are the order dollar amounts, and then I'll say NA if it's empty, so if nothing matches our inclusion criteria. So I just did that, and now with filter we get a whole set of data right here, and I can just fix up the formatting here a little bit. This dynamic range or spill range also means that whenever we update the underlying data, this will also be updated if anything matches our inclusion criteria right here. So this is the basic idea of how you use filter. You could do things like this in older versions of Excel before filter existed, but it was much harder. Filter is nice because it's easier to use, it keeps the original data in place, it updates as the data changes, and it creates a spill range that you can reference with other formulas. You will see this if you try to reference one of these ranges, you'll see a pound symbol after it, which means that you're dealing with a spill range. Now, filter is obviously very useful for data analysis because it's sort of like a simplified version of database functions or pivot tables. More definitely goes into pivot tables, but it's sort of a similar idea in that you're slicing and dicing the data based on a specific set of criteria. Filter is also useful for financial models when you're dealing with asset level modeling and you want to create lists of assets or summaries of different types of assets or company operations or regions. It can even be useful when you're calculating the internal rate of return metric, for example. So we'll get into all that, but for now, if you want the written version of this tutorial, the images and the sample Excel files, you can go to this URL on screen. It's on our Excel page under Excel filter function. I will also pin this as the first comment here. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how filter works when you have multiple criteria. Then we'll look at filter for private equity fund modeling. I'll explain how to use filter with the XIRR or IRR function, and then I'll show you how to make some of our private equity fund analysis more dynamic. So let's start with filter with multiple criteria. The basic idea here is that you can use something that I call the multiplication trick, where you have a column and you have a target, and then you have another column and another target, and you can multiply these together and use that as syntax in the filter function for the inclusion or include criteria. You can also create some drop-down menus using sort and unique and data validation to set up possible matches for organization and product names. And this gets very powerful because you can use a lot of different conditions and criteria. You can have not conditions, you can have greater than, less than, equal to. all sorts of other things like that. So let's go into Excel and demonstrate how this works. I'm going to delete everything that I just entered here because we don't need this anymore. And I'm going to say for now that we want to match these, the school/organization name of Banting University, and then the product name, product A. So to use multiple criteria here, I'll say filter, let's select this whole range of cells again, so B6 through J104. And then what we want to do is go to our column with the school/organization name. We'll select this whole thing, and then we'll say that this needs to be equal to our selection here, Banting University. I'm going to put parentheses around this, and then we'll go to column G, which has the product name. We'll take everything here, and then we'll say that this needs to be equal to product A right here. And then we'll say NA if it's empty, if nothing matches our inclusion criteria. So we just did that, and now we've set up filter to work with multiple criteria, and you can see how I could change it to something else. So I could say product B, or I could say product C, or product D, and then the set of records here keeps changing based on whatever I'm entering. So that is how you can set up filter to do this. Now, as I said, you can make it more flexible as well. For example, maybe we want to create drop-down menus here. So what you can do is say sort and unique, and then go over to all the university or organization names right here. And now we get a list of those. And then we can also create a list of product names. So sort, unique, and then let's go to our product column right here. We have those, and then we can go up here and I can go to data validation, Alt-DL in the PC version of Excel. On the Mac, you'll have to go to data and then go to data validation from there. You can go to allow, list, and then for source, you can select all these university or group names. And then for product name, same idea, Alt-DL, list, and then for source, you can select these and you have that. And now you have something even more powerful because you can simply select a university you want and then a product you want, and you get all the records that actually match up with whatever you selected right there. So this is a very simple example of how you can use filter with multiple criteria and drop-down menus to create something useful and user-friendly in Excel if you have to create this for someone else in your company, for example. So let's go to the private equity fund analysis now, and I'll show you how to use the filter function in more of a financial context. So oftentimes when you're analyzing private equity fund performance, you want to create a summary table that lists the invested capital, the realizations, the unrealized values, and the multiple of invested capital and internal rate of return for each portfolio company. Now, here we're dealing with gross numbers, and what that means is that gross is before the impact of management fees and carried interest. In other words, the fees that the private equity fund charges and also the performance fees they charge on the investment profits. We have a series of cash flows here where they have their investments in quite a few different companies. They have management fees charged each year, and then they have unrealized values at the end, and then carried interest, and then they have one company with a realization here. So they sold this company Cyber Sentinel AI for about $1.4 billion. And so we have a series of different types of cash flows and values right here, and we need to create a summary table over here of everything. In the old days, the way to do this would be to select the data and then remove duplicates and then delete the NA line item for use in the table. So let's go and see what this looks like. A long time ago in Excel, you had to select all the company data here and then do a copy and paste, and then you'd have to go to Alt-A-M for remove duplicates. You do that, and then you would delete the NA right here, and then you would have a list of company names that you could input into the table right here. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but the problem is that if you do it like that, it's not really dynamic, because if anything in your underlying data ever changes, if a company is added or a company is deleted, for example, then you have to go through this process every single time something changes. So it's not really ideal and it's not truly flexible. The new way to do it is to use unique, sort, and filter to remove the NA that we do not care about and to capture the other company names. What we can say is filter, unique, and then we'll select all these company names right here. This is already a named cell range called fund_companies. So this is the array that we're filtering. And then what we want to say here is that we'll take all the unique values right here, and we want to include anything that is not equal to NA. So I'll say not equal to NA. In Excel, I'm using this symbol less than, greater than to mean not equal to. we could add NA afterward in case nothing matches, although it's not really necessary in this case. And now you can see how we get a spill range here, it automatically fills up. And now if we ever add something or change something here, so let's say that we delete legalese AI, for example. Well, if I do that now, you can see that it updates. Now we still have too many rows used here, but you can see how this range updates, and now we no longer get that company because it's no longer listed as one of the private equity fund's investments. So that's the advantage of using a dynamic array function like filter to set this up. Now, once you have this in place, the next step is that you have to set up all these other functions and formulas, such as the date of investment and the date of exit. And with the dates, you can actually use XLOOKUP and a similar multiplication trick there to find the dates based on the criteria in 2 columns in this specific range. So you can use this trick with XLOOKUP and say XLOOKUP1, and then you can say that you want to reference this fund companies column and say that this needs to be equal to cell I13 here, so the company name. We'll anchor the I part of that, and then for the other criteria here, we'll link to the fund items column, and we'll say that this needs to be equal to the item here, the investment right here, because we want to get the investment date. I'll anchor the 10 part. And then for the return array, we want to return the dates right here in our XLOOKUP function. And I can say NA after this, although it's not really necessary in this case. And then I can just copy and paste this down, and I can copy and paste it over for the exit dates. And so that's how you would start setting up this type of table. Now, the other functions and formulas are all pretty simple. These are just sum ifs. I think you probably know how these work if you're looking at this tutorial by now, but sum ifs can be very, very helpful for bringing in the appropriate investments or unrealized values depending on the company, for example, and doing a match based on that. For the IRR function, we are just using the standard compound annualized growth rate formula. We're using year frac to take the difference between the investment date and the exit date, or between the investment date and the fund evaluation date, the end of 2025 right here. So that is how all of that works. We also have this total row here at the bottom, and I'm going to delete the gross IRR for now because I want to show you separately how that works. Here, the total column is set up in pretty much the same way you'd expect. We're just adding up everything and we're taking the total value and dividing by the invested capital to get the gross multiple of invested capital. So moving on, I want to go into that next step and show you how you can use filter with XIRR and IRR here. One question that often comes up is that you want to evaluate the gross IRR for an entire private equity fund, and oftentimes you will be given something like this set of cash flows right here. Now for the gross IRR, you want to ignore the management fees and also the carried interest, and you want to focus on just the realizations, the unrealized values, and the investments in this period. So the question is what to do with irregular dates and how can we ignore these management fees and carried interest. For the irregular dates, if you look at this series closely, you'll see that some of these investments are made on March 31st, some are on May 31st, some are on July 15th. But that's pretty simple. We can use the XIRR function for that, and then we can use filter to calculate the IRR based on only certain cash flows in this period rather than everything there. So by using filter, you could calculate either the net IRR or the gross IRR depending on what you want. And we can actually apply filter to both the values and the dates used in XIRR, and we can use the not operator at the same time. So let me enter this and break down how it works. I will go over here and I'll start by entering the XIRR function. So we need to enter a series of values and then a series of dates. And then I will say filter, and we'll go over to the fund amounts right here. And then for the inclusion criteria, I'll say not, and I'll say that the fund items here cannot be equal to the management fee up there. And then I'll multiply and I'll say that the fund items should also not be equal to the carried interest because we want to explicitly ignore anything that is labeled management fee or carried interest right here. And I'll say NA if this is somehow empty. And then for the dates, we can do pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to take this filter right here and I'm just going to change some of the fields. So here, instead of the fund amounts, we're going to link to the fund dates instead. So right there. And then everything else here can actually stay the same. So we have that. And I think I forgot a parentheses or an extra parentheses here at the end. But you can see how this works. I'm going to actually expand this a little bit so you can see the formula a little bit more effectively. you can see that all we're doing here is using filter to create the inputs to the XIRR function so that we're explicitly ignoring the management fees and carried interest. And it really is just the standard XIRR function, just arranged a little bit differently from what you expect. And this is how it can be so useful to set up filter like this, because of the fact that it works with the not operator. So you can literally tell it to ignore certain cash flows depending on what you are calculating. So this is just one example of how you can use it, but this type of thing is very useful when you're analyzing a private equity fund, as we are right here. So we're almost done. I do want to cover one last topic though, which is how to make this even more dynamic. Filter and unique are good because they can update the company names automatically, but one issue is that we're still using traditional functions for the rest, and we still have a normal summation at the bottom, so we could still get some spill errors here. One solution here is to make everything into a dynamic array function so that the range keeps expanding or shrinking and all the sums and all the other formulas update correctly at the same time. Now, this can make the model a bit complicated and it might be overkill for simple analyses, but I do want to show you a slightly more advanced example here of how you can use filter and XLOOKUP and related functions. So before I do anything else here, let me just illustrate the problem. Let's say that I go in and I create some other number here, and I say that the investment date is June 30th, 2024. I say it's an investment, and I say it's for 500 million. Well, we get a spill error here because we no longer have enough space to actually reflect this. One way we can fix it is by deleting this total row here at the bottom. And now it allows us to spill this down and to get the company names all displayed down there. So that's going to be our baseline for doing this. I'll also delete this company name X because we don't really need it. I was just doing that for demonstration purposes. Now to make this truly dynamic and to make it so that even when a company name is added, these functions keep spilling downward, we can do the following. Here, I'm going to change how XLOOKUP works, and I'm going to base it on filter instead. So I'll say XLOOKUP. I will link to this range right here, I13. You can see how we're using the pound symbol because this is a spill range from a dynamic array function. I will anchor the I part, and then I'll do a filter. I will base it on the companies over here. And then for the inclusion criteria, we'll say that the fund items must equal investment. In other words, we only want to get investment dates right here. I'll say NA if this is empty. And then for the return array, we can set up a filter based on similar criteria, except now we're going to get the fund dates and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at the fund items here and we're going to only care about the ones that actually match the investments here, that actually represent investment dates. So we have that. I'll say NA if it's not available, and then I'll say NA on the outside of the function if that's not available. Once again, I forgot a parentheses here, so let me go in and fix that. And now I'll delete everything below, and you can see how it dynamically fills down and corresponds exactly to the list we have right here. I can also copy this over, and we can get it for the exit date right here, and it's a very similar formula. It's just that now we're going one item over to realizations right here. Now for the rest of these formulas, it's a very similar idea to where instead of just linking to a single cell reference right here, such as I13, we're actually going to link to this entire range, I13 with a pound sign. So we can do that for invested capital, and then we could copy it over for the rest, but I think you get the idea. Essentially, now we have a much more flexible setup because whenever we add a new item, it's going to be reflected right here. So going back to that example, if I enter something like company X, and then I say June 30th, 2024, investment for 200 million. The formatting here is a little bit off, but this whole range expanded dynamically to feature our new addition down here. And as we keep adding to this set of data, it keeps expanding to reflect that. So that's how you can make it more flexible. I'm not going to go through the whole process of modifying all these other formulas, but this should give you an idea of how powerful these types of functions such as filter and XLOOKUP can be when you use them together. So that's about it. To do a recap and summary now, first, I started by showing you how to use filter with multiple criteria. With this type of setup, I find that it's really useful to use data validation and to use functions like unique and sort to create categories of items that the user can select from. And you can use this multiplication trick to input multiple criteria into the filter function. Then I showed you how to use it for private equity fund modeling to get the company names first off based on unique and filter. Then I showed you how to apply filter to the XIRR function to remove the management fees and carried interest. For example, when you are calculating the gross IRR, because you want to ignore them, the gross numbers are before those fees. And then finally, I showed you a little bit of how to make this more dynamic. We didn't finish all the setup here, but hopefully this should give you enough to give you a flavor of what is required to make this truly dynamic and to make all the formulas update automatically as you add and remove data from the set. So that's about it. Hopefully now you know a little bit more about how filter works and how it can be useful, especially when you're working with asset level financial models.